Good evening. My name is Leon Rubinstein, and can you hear me? My name is Leon Rubinstein, and I am a Holocaust survivor. I never really liked that label, Holocaust survivor. I always consider myself born in the wrong place, wrong time. I was born in a shtetl, which is a small city in Eastern Europe called Koretz. The year was 1930. I was one of 7 children, 5 sisters and 1 brother. The 4th child born to the most wonderful, wonderful parents, Edith and Wolf Rubinstein. Koretz is one of the oldest cities in Eastern Europe. Jews had lived there from the 13th century on. Koretz has a Jewish cemetery which is over 1,000 years old. Koretz had a textile factory dating back to the 18th century, which employed 120 Jews. Koretz was a center of Hasidim, very religious people. In 1930, the Jewish population in Koretz was 4,000 Jews, and that was 87% of the total population. On July the 2nd, 1941, the German army entered Koretz. On August 8, 1941, the German army, with the help of the local Christian collaborators, gathered 350 of the youngest and most able Jewish men from the ages of 18 to 35. They were loaded on trucks under the promise of work. They were taken just 2 miles out of town. They were made to dig their own graves. And they were made to lay on the backs of their already shot brothers, fathers, neighbors, and friends. And they were shot in the back of their head. The local farmers who came to watch all this filled the graves with dirt. The German authorities organized a local militia from the Christian community in Koretz. They also asked for a Jewish representative to represent the Jews in Koretz. A gentleman by the name of Moshe Krasnostavsky was picked. After attending only 1 meeting, he went home and committed suicide by hanging in protest. On May 21st, 1942, my family was awakened at 4 in the morning by German soldiers and were forced out of the house. My father had built hiding places in the house for such an occasion. My father, brother, 1 sister, and I found ourselves outside of the house. My mother and 4 sisters made it to one of the hiding places in the house. Across the street from us, there lived a dentist. His 16-year-old daughter ran out of the house screaming. And the German soldiers that was guarding us aimed his rifle and shot her dead. I took that opportunity to make a run for it back into my house. I remember that morning being under the spell of anesthesia. No one shared any emotions. No one cried, no one screamed. We knew we'd all be dead soon. They marched all the people from the front of our house to a central gathering place in the city. My father took a chance and made a run for it. 2 shots were fired at him before he found himself a hiding place where he can actually sort of survive that particular moment. $2,500 people were taken from Courage to a town called Kozak, 6 miles from the city. There were 2 graves waiting for them. 2,500 people died that morning. And the local farmers filled the grave with just about 10 inches of dirt. After about 10 days, the body started to decompose, and the local farmers started to complain. And they asked for the Jews that survived the slaughter to go to Kazakh and fill the graves with dirt. My father and I and 22 other Jews went to Kazakh with their own shovels and worked there for 3 hours to fill the graves. One can only imagine how much work was done there in such a short time, under such horrific and stressful conditions. More tears were shed there than dirt was moved. When we came back from the graves, the surviving Jews were forced into a ghetto. The authorities sectioned off a couple of houses not too far from our home. That part of town was easier for them to control. My family took over a house that was previously occupied by Jews. There was still a large family and 5 children needed to be fed. But there was no food to be found anywhere. One day, while in the ghetto, a policeman showed up with his bike to be repaired. And while my father was working on the bike, this policeman asked my father, "How did you make out in the first slaughter?" My father answered that he lost a son and a daughter. The policeman replied, "Then that means you would have more bread for the rest of the family." I looked at my father's face, and he looked like he was stabbed in his heart. While we were in the ghetto, my father concentrated on finding hiding places for us. My father was constantly on the go, never gave up searching for hiding places. He turned to whoever would help him. It was like we were drowning in a river and sinking, and he was just reaching out to anybody that would sort of give him a hand. One morning, my father woke me up at about 4 a.m. and informed me that we would be leaving the ghetto, which in itself was a very dangerous move. And we we started to walk, a strong man with a small boy at his side. What amazed me about this trip out of the ghetto was the guts and intuition that my father had. Mind you, no map, no signs, no roads, walking through potato and wheat fields. After walking a couple of hours, my father told me we were going to Risk and visit my best friend from school, a Gentile. My father found the farm as if he had just visited it yesterday. We were greeted by my best friend from school, whose father was at war. And he was the man of the house. My father convinced him that I should hide out at the farm. I am sure that it wasn't the first time that my father visited the farm. I was there for 2 years, hiding in whatever place I could. I didn't realize that my best friend was also fighting against the Russians and fighting for the liberation of the Ukraine. He was quite a leader. One morning, the Russian army sent 250 soldiers to look for my friend. They found me hiding in a hole in the potato fields, just 500 feet away from the house. And that was really my lucky day. After 63 years of not talking about the Holocaust, not discussing it with anybody, especially my family, I was convinced to write my memoirs. And I'm glad I did it because at least I'm going to be leaving something for my 5 grandchildren and 2 beautiful children that I have, a son and a daughter. The name of the book that I wrote is As I Am Presently Known. The name came because I traveled a lot, spoke different languages, tasted different foods, had to adjust to all sorts of life, and has to sort of more or less make a way of surviving. I'll just read part of a chapter. The name of the chapter is Discovered by the Red Army. By May of 1944, I was 14 years old, still living in the potato field. I didn't realize the Russians had liberated the area a few months before. The woman never told me. There I was, smelly and filthy, never washed my body, never brushed my teeth, hadn't had a haircut in years, wearing the same pants and shirt from my daddy brought me to the farm. These clothes were just like rags. I'd been alone all the time, didn't know that the war was coming to an end. Early one morning, around 3 o'clock, I heard a lot of activity outside my home. People were there, and the language I heard wasn't German, it was Russian. A whole company of Russian soldiers were coming the potato field. There were 250 of them. The Russians had mounted a campaign against the Ukrainian underground. The Banderites, They were searching for my best friend because he was quite a leader. They advanced across the field, pounding the ground with bayonets, 16 inches long. Soon they hit the board covering my hole. I heard a bayonet going through the wood, but I was just far enough so he did not touch me. The board was 6 or 8 inches below the surface, just deep enough to hold up a potato plant. It was like they put a pitchfork through the wood and lifted up a cover. I was exposed in the moonlight, all folded up and shivering. Right away, the soldiers who found me summoned their captain. They pointed at me, they spit on the ground, they started talking to me in Russian. I saw the red star of the Russian uniform, and I couldn't say a word. I didn't know what to make of it. They motioned me to come out, but I was too shaken to move. So they pulled me out by my neck. They dragged me to my friend's farmhouse and put me down outside. They kept talking to me, but I couldn't speak. It was freezing cold in the middle of the night, and I was chilled to the bone. When the sun came up, a woman captain approached me. She was in her. This is somebody we have to take care of. Soon someone put a blanket on me, gave me some bread and water. Once the woman captain came, they treated me like a different person. They put me on a wagon and brought me to a nearby farm, handed me a pail of water to wash up, gave me a Russian uniform. It was 2 or 3 sizes too big, but it was warm. And they gave me a bit more food. Still, I couldn't speak. The Jewish captain appeared. She realized the family had been hiding me. She told me, "These are bad people." She did not know how I survived. She told me she was looking for the son, my best friend. The Russians found my friend in a nearby cemetery that morning, and they killed him. They took the mother and daughters out of the house and they burned it down. Burned the farm too. But they didn't harm the mother and daughters. I told the captain that the family was good to me. Without him, I couldn't have survived. This woman, captain, was the one that told me the Russians had been in the area close to 6 months while I was still hiding in the potato field. She couldn't understand why I was still in hiding. She said maybe they were using me for a bargaining chip. If something happened, they could say, "By the way, I have a Jew. I'll trade him for this or that." She told me I was lucky to have survived. Another captain was called in, a young guy, 26 years old. He took me under his wing, made sure I stayed with his group. He gave me an automatic weapon and a military hat. And so I became a little soldier with the Red Army. The captain brought me to Koretz, the city that I was born, to find people I might recognize. Some of the Jews who survived had returned, trying to piece their lives together. I saw a few neighbors. They were living in whatever house was available to them. The captain asked me, "Where is your house?" I pointed to an area where my house used to be, but it was gone. must have been burned down. Nothing to hold onto. Before the first slaughter in college, I woke up one night and heard some noise in our backyard. I looked out the window and I saw my father digging a hole. At his side, I saw documents, probably a birth certificate and the deed to the house, and maybe some silver, even my mother's ring. He buried all of these goods, washed his hand at a water barrel, and came back into the house. I went back to sleep, never brought it up with my father. When I returned to college with the Russian captain, I told him about the buried goods. But since the house was gone, I didn't know where to search. The house left no footprint. It was completely erased, just land and nothing to prove I ever lived there. The captain took me every other day to college to see new people. At night I stayed with the Russian. They gave me a military cot to sleep in, the kind of cot the United States Army is still using today. And they shared their food with me. Canned sardines, canned cheese, and dried potatoes. There was plenty for me to eat. The food was made in the United States, except for the potatoes. I could see the labels on the cans, even though I couldn't read them. The potatoes probably came from Russia. Eating that food was a way I regained my strength. The Russian soldiers' main job was going on missions to hunt down and kill Ukrainians who were fighting for their independence. I went on these missions with the Russians. They were absolutely ruthless. They'd walk into a house, break the doors down most of the time. They'd find women and children. Without asking questions, they would start shooting. They didn't want to take any fire from the locals. I had come out of hell, and then to see this being given to the Ukrainian was just too much. Even though most of them treated the Jews like dogs. I didn't feel so hostile to the locals at the time. It was the locals that murdered my family. But they also saved my life. To see such violence against them was unacceptable to me. But I had nowhere else to go. After they finished their mission in Poretz, I traveled with the Russians to Rovno. They took over a barracks, a jail, and a police station. I moved in there with them. From that base, they began launching attacks. They wanted to scare the locals into another way of life. Scared them into thinking that fighting the Russian government was never going to work. One afternoon, they gathered 25 young men. The youngest was 12, the oldest 25. They set up a lynching spot in the marketplace. It was a big open space, and the lynching platform was huge. It was going the length of a football field. I saw soldiers building these things out of logs. I didn't understand what they were constructing. I knew something dramatic was going to happen. It took for them a day to build. The next morning, they brought 6 truckloads of these young men, and they hung them all. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I just couldn't understand what was happening. The truck would pull up to a section of the platform, and they would hang 4 guys at a time. The truck would back up and deliver another group. They'd put up 4 more and 4 more. They had soldiers guarding the area so nobody would raise any hell. I was one of the soldiers guarding the platform. Other soldiers dragged in the locals to watch the mass hanging. Before it was done, I saw 25 of these guys hanging there. There was no trial, nothing. It was a horrible scene. Some of them were peeing, some were going in their pants. I was standing in front of the other lynching area like the rest of the guards. Felt dizzy and sick. I said to myself, I can't take this. God forbid someone would start running and I would have to start shooting. When this mass hanging happened, it turned me all the way around. And I knew my days with the Russians were coming to an end. Around that time, I used to walk the streets of Rovno by myself, getting familiar with the surroundings. I wore my Russian uniform and carried my gun. It was the first time I'd been in a metropolitan city. While I was walking one day, a boy my age came and started talking to me in Russian. He asked me if I was Jewish. We struck up a conversation. I learned he was a Jewish orphan like me that survived the war. His parents were killed. He survived by hiding up in the forest, where he lost a toe to frostbite. His name is Aaron Garlick. Aaron was living with his aunt and uncle, Asher Edelman. Asher had 2 sons and a wife that had somehow survived the war. The 5 of them occupied a house. Aaron took a liking to me and brought me to his uncle's place. At first, Aaron's relatives didn't know what to make of me with my Russian uniform and gun, but we started to talk, and I told them I came from Koretz. They knew some people that knew my family. Pretty soon, Aaron's aunt made a soup from herring and potatoes. The warm smell of the herring filled the house. When the soup was done, she served me a hot bowl with my own spoon. It was the most delicious thing I tasted in years. My captain, the guy that was my mentor, one morning he was killed right in front of me. When my mentor was killed, my stay with the Russians was definitely over. I didn't want to be with them. While my mentor was alive, he talked about sending me to a Russian school, a military school. He told me he had some connections. I never really wanted to do that. But it showed that he cared. As a survivor, I endured degradation and deprivation and lost everything and everyone I loved. But I never lost my ties to Judaism. Thank you very much for being here. If you have any questions, I'll take some.